Dive into the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire, a city of canals, floating gardens, and grand temples, where ambition met paranoia and a mysterious disease changed everything. Let's explore
Part 1. The Early Whispers of an Empire. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with a journey far from the familiar streets of Europe, over oceans and past deserts, until we arrive in the heart of Mesoamerica. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a lukewarm cup of something, and let's float slowly into the story of an empire that built grand cities, had an impressive number of temples, and somehow managed to collapse spectacularly within just a century. Yes, we're talking about the Aztec Empire. Now, when we imagine the Aztecs, most people picture grand pyramids, sun god rituals, and a society that was, a little more into human sacrifice than your average neighborhood barbecue. But before the temples, the conquests, and the inevitable doom brought by strangers across the ocean, there was something quieter, something humble. These were wandering tribes, known collectively as the Mexica, moving around the Valley of Mexico, trying to find a home. Picture a group of people wandering, complaining about the mud, the mosquitoes, and the weird neighbors who insist their gods are better than everyone else's. That was basically the start. Around the 13th century, the Mexica were not exactly the pinnacle of civilization. They were considered outsiders, second-class wanderers, often ridiculed by older city-states like Azcapotzalco. But of course, the Mexica had patience, and more importantly, stubbornness. A lot of it. There's a reason their legend includes an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake, because even their mythology has that slightly dramatic, we're going to prove everyone wrong eventually, energy. Eventually, the Mexica were granted land on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco. Not the most appealing real estate by modern standards. Imagine moving into a place where your neighbors call it a soggy, mosquito-infested nightmare, and yet you think, this is perfect. We can build an empire here. They named this city Tenochtitlan, which would later rival Venice in terms of canals, except with more temples and fewer gondoliers. The city was ambitious, sprawling, and carefully planned. Canals instead of streets, causeways connecting the city to the mainland, floating gardens that are somehow still fascinating to scientists today. It was an engineering project so clever that modern urban planners still squint at it and mutter things like, well, I guess they had water management down centuries before we did. Of course, life on an island isn't all idyllic. You have to deal with flooding, waterborne diseases, and the occasional angry neighbor from the mainland. But the Mexica adapted. They farmed on chinampas, which are basically artificial floating gardens. Imagine, if you will, a perfectly calm lake covered in what looks like a patchwork quilt of fertile green plots. It's slightly unnerving in a serene way, like the world's quietest strategy game. And with these gardens, Tenochtitlan could feed thousands of people, which in a society where status and hierarchy matter, makes you suddenly very interesting to potential allies and enemies. Speaking of hierarchy, the Mexica had an interesting system. At the top was the Tlatoni, which translates roughly to speaker, though it really means we hope this person is wise and not completely incompetent. The first notable ruler was Acamapechtli, who, despite probably having a better sense of fashion than his predecessors, spent much of his reign consolidating power, marrying strategically, and setting the tone for future dynasties. Dynastic politics were already complicated. Marriages were political tools, alliances were fragile, and the occasional assassination was treated like an unfortunate inconvenience, not headline news. But that's nothing unique. Most royal families throughout history have a similar pattern of mild chaos wrapped in velvet robes. Now, by the time the 15th century rolled around, the Mexica had begun expanding aggressively. Now, expansion has a funny way of working out. It either makes you really rich and famous, or it makes you the reason future historians sigh and mutter about hubris. The Aztec Empire was no exception. They were smart, organized, and ruthless when necessary. They perfected tribute systems, which means they could extract wealth from conquered peoples without technically burning every village to the ground, though they did sometimes do exactly that when feeling particularly dramatic. Tributes could be anything from food, cotton, and cocoa beans to, well, the occasional human offering for temple ceremonies. And yes, this last part tends to get the most attention when people teach about the Aztecs in school, because nothing says fun afternoon history lesson than ritual sacrifice. Now, I should pause here and say that while the Aztec leaders could be ruthless, they were also remarkably strategic. They didn't just conquer blindly. They formed alliances with other city-states, leveraged local disputes, and of course played a lot of political chess. Moctezuma I, who ruled in the mid-1400s, was particularly adept at this. He expanded the empire's territory, reinforced the tribute system, and built monumental architecture. Temples were enlarged, roads improved, and trade routes expanded. He also had a reputation for piety. Apparently, nothing says we're powerful and competent like building giant temples in honor of your gods, which simultaneously feeds the economy, inspires loyalty, and subtly terrifies anyone thinking about rebellion. Now, let's float over to another royal disaster, or at least another interesting personality. Moctezuma II, perhaps the most infamous Aztec ruler, comes into view as the empire reaches its peak. He inherited a flourishing empire, a city with grand marketplaces and a well-oiled tribute machine. But Moctezuma II was also a man prone to paranoia. There are countless accounts of him engaging in rituals to predict the future, obsessively consulting astrologers, and generally assuming that any stranger might be an omen of doom. And in a society so focused on signs, omens, and the favor of gods, you can imagine this created a lot of awkward moments. Oh, look, the sun rose at a funny angle. Someone must be plotting against me. These kinds of thoughts may not sound unusual for a 21st century Tuesday morning, but for Moctezuma, they were life-defining. Under his reign, the empire reached its largest territorial extent, stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific and encompassing diverse peoples, languages, and climates. Managing this required a combination of fear, tribute, and diplomacy, and occasionally dramatic displays of religious devotion. The Aztec religion was intricate, involving dozens of gods, each with their own spheres of influence, rituals, and temple requirements. Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god, demanded constant attention, which meant human sacrifices, grand ceremonies, and probably a lot of incense that gave priests a perpetual headache. The whole system was elaborate, terrifying, and oddly organized, like a bureaucracy built on devotion and occasional existential terror. By now, Tenochtitlan was a marvel. Floating gardens, stone temples, canals, marketplaces bustling with exotic goods, dancers, musicians, and scholars. It was a city that could impress even the snootiest European traveler. Or so one might hope, because some of them would later arrive and, as history tells us, absolutely misunderstand what was happening. But before we get to those fateful first contacts, it's worth noting how remarkable the Aztec achievements were, considering their recent rise from wandering outsiders to rulers of a sprawling empire. They had built a civilization that rivaled anything in Europe in terms of sophistication, trade, and urban planning, all while adhering to customs and rituals that were, by their own standards, entirely reasonable. If that sounds chaotic to a modern reader, it's because the Aztec world doesn't translate neatly into modern logic. But in context, it worked. And it worked very, very well until it didn't. At this point, we can settle into the daily life of an average Aztec citizen. Let's picture ourselves walking through Tenochtitlan. The streets are canals, bridges connect different districts, and everywhere you look, there are merchants hawking cacao beans, textiles, obsidian tools, and sometimes, depending on the day, a small human sacrifice for the temple. Children are learning to weave, trade, and recite religious chants, while elders argue about omens and prophecies. Life is structured, hierarchical, and imbued with a sense of cosmic significance. You always know your place in society, from emperor to merchant to farmer, which is comforting in a strangely rigid way.
Part 2. When strangers arrive and things get awkward. Alright, so we left Tenochtitlan humming along. Canals reflecting temples, merchants shouting about cocoa beans, and Moctezuma II nervously consulting omens like a man who just realized he might have overbooked his spiritual appointments. Everything was more or less humming along until the Atlantic decided to get involved. Let's set the stage. It's the early 16th century. Across the ocean, Europeans are not exactly content with their local scenery. Spain, having finished the whole "let's kick the Moors out" project, is feeling restless, wealthy, and slightly overeager. Conquistadors, which is basically a fancy Spanish word for guy who wants other people's stuff, are preparing for a very long, uncomfortable voyage across the Atlantic. One of these men, Hernán Cortés, would eventually become infamous, not because he had superpowers, but because he had the right combination of ambition, ruthlessness, and good timing. Cortés and his entourage, roughly 500 men, a few horses, and what seems to be an alarming level of self-confidence, land on the Yucatan coast in 1519. And here's the thing, Moctezuma II has been hearing rumors, sightings of strange floating beasts, men on horses that make more noise than a whole marketplace, and shining armor that is slightly alarming in the sun. The empire's astrologers and soothsayers might have had some fun with this one, but of course, interpreting omens in a complex society often leads to overthinking. And Moctezuma, prone to paranoia, sees opportunity and threat at roughly the same rate. Cortés, meanwhile, is doing his usual thing. Charm everyone, make some alliances, and never, under any circumstances, let morality get in the way of profit. He befriends discontented local tribes who aren't exactly thrilled about paying tribute to the Aztecs. A convenient plot twist. Internal dissent within the empire is real. People from subject cities grumble about taxes, forced labor, and occasional involuntary offerings to the gods. Cortés is basically walking into a pre-existing office dispute and deciding, I can manage this situation. Upon arrival at Tenochtitlan, things get complicated in the best and worst ways. Moctezuma, ever the cautious ruler, decides that the polite thing to do is invite these strangers into his palace. And by polite, I mean, let's treat them like honored guests until we figure out if they're gods, demons, or just annoying tourists. Cortés, sensing exactly what to do, show deference, study the terrain, and slowly tighten the noose, is playing a game that Moctezuma doesn't even know exists. There's an irony here, of course. Moctezuma is living in what is probably the most sophisticated city in the Americas at the time, with canals, floating gardens, bustling markets, and temples taller than anything Cortés has seen back in Spain. Yet he's cautious, slightly paranoid, and extremely polite to these people who have just arrived on boats. Imagine hosting guests in your palace and realizing over the course of dinner that they're planning to completely take over your house. It's awkward. Then things escalate. Cortés decides that simply being polite isn't enough. The empire itself must be under his control. So he takes the step of taking Moctezuma hostage inside his own palace. There's a sense of irony here that even 21st century humans would appreciate. The emperor of a vast, wealthy empire is now literally a guest under house arrest in the city he built. It's not subtle. It's effective, and apparently it works for a little while. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Tenochtitlan is restless. The Spanish presence, combined with rumors, fear, and general dissatisfaction with the empire's rigid structure, begins to stir unease. Moctezuma, still hoping for diplomacy to work, tries to maintain calm, but the city's population doesn't exactly appreciate having their sacred spaces occupied by foreign men with armor, guns, and horses that poop everywhere. It's messy. Things get worse with the so-called La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night. Essentially, the Spanish attempt to leave the city, and the Aztecs, understandably displeased, attack. The Spanish suffer casualties, Moctezuma dies, circumstances unclear and perhaps a result of either his own people or the Spanish, and the situation turns from tense to catastrophic. The city, resilient and proud, has now seen its first major confrontation with foreign invaders, who are both persistent and unnervingly adaptable. At this point, it's worth noting how much luck, disease, and timing contribute to historical outcomes. Cortés retreats, regroups, and eventually returns with reinforcements. Meanwhile, smallpox, imported from Europe, spreads like wildfire. The epidemic doesn't care about temples, social hierarchies, or rituals. It ravages the population, weakening Tenochtitlan from the inside out. One moment, the city is vibrant and bustling. The next, entire districts are depopulated, with panic, grief, and confusion following in the wake of the disease. The Aztec rulers had never experienced anything quite like it, and there was no magical ritual to make smallpox go away. And so the siege begins in earnest. Cortés, with his reinforcements and local allies, begins the long process of subduing the city. The canals, so ingeniously designed for daily life, now become obstacles and strategic challenges. Bridges are destroyed, defenses are tested, and people starve. It's a slow, grinding process, not dramatic, not fiery in a Hollywood sense, but devastating nonetheless. Temples stand, markets quiet, and the population dwindles. The city that once seemed invincible is suddenly struggling to sustain its own people. Moctezuma's successors, though valiant, cannot turn back the tide. The combination of Spanish military technology, indigenous alliances, and the unstoppable march of disease proves too much. When Tenochtitlan finally falls in 1521, it is not a cinematic explosion of conquest, but a methodical dismantling of social and urban systems. Cortés enters the city, the temples are looted, the markets fall silent, and a new political reality begins. It's strange to think that an empire so vibrant, so complex, and so advanced could collapse within just a few years of first contact. The story isn't heroic, and it's not particularly satisfying. There are no grand speeches, no singular battle that defines the outcome. Instead, it's a slow unraveling, a combination of misjudgment, foreign ambition, and biological inevitability. And yet, from the ashes, new societies emerge, blending Aztec traditions with Spanish colonial structures, creating a hybrid culture that continues to influence the region centuries later. And now, dear listener, as we float gently over the ruins of what was once a bustling metropolis, it's worth taking a moment to reflect. The Aztec Empire wasn't just a society of pyramids, markets, and sacrifices. It was a human story. Ambition, ingenuity, fear, adaptation, and ultimately, vulnerability. The rise and fall of Tenochtitlan reminds us that no matter how impressive a civilization appears, it is always subject to forces beyond its control. Foreign contact, disease, and the unpredictable quirks of human behavior. So let's take a slow breath. Imagine the canals again, the floating gardens, the temples now silent, and the echoes of people whose lives were disrupted in ways they could never have foreseen. The empire has fallen, yes, but it's left behind a tapestry of cultural, architectural, and historical threads that continue to fascinate historians, tourists, and dreamers alike. And with that, we pause for a moment in contemplation, because the Aztec story, while ending in tragedy, is not devoid of beauty.
It is complex, human, and, like all great histories, a little bittersweet. The rise was slow and deliberate, the fall was inexorable, and the lessons, well, they float quietly, like canoes on Lake Texcoco, waiting for anyone patient enough to notice.
Part 3. Echoes of an Empire. Culture, Legacy, and Quiet Persistence. So, we've drifted through the rise of the Mexica, wandered the canals of Tenochtitlan, and watched, with quiet fascination, as the Spanish arrived, and through a combination of audacity, alliances, and the quiet menace of smallpox, dismantled what had seemed like an invincible city. But let's settle in now and consider something slightly more subtle, the afterlife of the Aztec Empire. Not a ghost story, not a cinematic revenge fantasy, but the slow, curious persistence of culture, memory, and human quirks long after the rulers have fallen. After 1521, the Valley of Mexico was a quieter, stranger place. The bustling marketplaces of Tenochtitlan had been reduced, temples looted, and much of the urban population decimated by disease and war. The Spanish established Mexico City on the ruins of the Aztec capital, and they did so with remarkable efficiency. From a logistical standpoint, it was like repurposing someone else's Lego city and then insisting it looks entirely original. The canals remained, at least initially, though gradually filled in or altered to suit colonial urban deeds. But here's the thing about culture. It doesn't vanish as neatly as a conquered city. Language, rituals, crafts, and knowledge often persist quietly, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, continued to be spoken, documented, and studied, surviving alongside Spanish. Codices, those intricately painted manuscripts recording history, genealogy, and rituals, were hidden, preserved, or adapted for European eyes, often with strange combinations of imagery that made sense only to those who remembered the original context. Scholars today, leafing through these codices, often remark on the sheer meticulousness of the Aztec record-keeping. They cataloged tribute, rituals, and celestial events with the precision of accountants who had discovered the joy of ritualized bureaucracy. Religious traditions persisted too, albeit in transformed ways. Some rituals were suppressed or adapted, saints replaced gods, churches built on top pyramids, yet the underlying patterns survived. It's fascinating. Humans have a way of quietly sneaking their old habits into new frameworks. Where the Spanish imposed Christian festivals, indigenous communities often merged their own seasonal celebrations, dances, and symbols. It's subtle, almost invisible if you're not paying attention, but it's undeniably Aztec in origin. Cultural persistence, in other words, is often quieter than conquest, but no less significant. And then there's the architecture. While many of the grand temples were destroyed or dismantled for stone, foundations remained. Spanish colonial architects who admired certain aspects of Mesoamerican engineering, canals, urban layouts, and causeways sometimes incorporated these elements into new designs. Imagine building a cathedral and realizing your foundation was laid by people who designed floating gardens and raised platforms with far more sophistication than your local quarry workers understood. The result is a city layered in history, streets aligned along Aztec grids, churches rising above former temples, and every corner carrying a quiet, lingering memory of what was. Economic practices, too, left their mark. Markets persisted in various forms, trade networks adapted to colonial structures, and cacao, maize, and chili peppers remained central to both diet and commerce. The tribute system, while no longer politically enforced by an emperor, influenced tax collection, labor organization, and even social hierarchies under Spanish rule. It's a reminder that some innovations, even when the original rulers are gone, are too practical to simply vanish. Let's pause and reflect on the human side. The people who survived Tenochtitlan's fall had lived through extreme upheaval,
loss of family, city, and political autonomy. Yet they persisted. They learned to navigate colonial bureaucracy, convert when necessary, and subtly maintain their traditions. And many individuals, often anonymous in historical records, adapted in ways that were quietly remarkable. Think of artisans secretly preserving motifs in their work, or elders teaching Nahuatl to grandchildren who were expected to speak Spanish. The empire's end was not the end of its people's ingenuity or memory. The story also reminds us of unintended consequences. The Spanish likely imagined that conquest would result in total domination, political, cultural, and spiritual. Instead, the result was something more nuanced. The fusion of Aztec and Spanish elements created something new, what we now call Mexican culture. Dishes like tamales and mole blend ingredients and techniques from pre-Columbian and European traditions. Festivals such as Dia de los Muertos carry echoes of Aztec beliefs about the death and the afterlife, overlaid with Catholic rituals. Even city layouts, art styles, and public ceremonies carry subtle whispers of the Mexica past. In other words, conquest didn't erase the Aztecs. It transformed them into something resilient and hybrid. Historically, it's also fascinating how the Aztecs themselves survived through adaptation and reinterpretation. Many codices were reproduced or translated under Spanish supervision, some to impress European audiences, others to document surviving knowledge. Historians now piece together Aztec life from these layered documents, interpreting tribute lists, ritual diagrams, and pictographs that recorded everything from social hierarchy to agricultural cycles. The more you study these records, the more you realize that the Aztec civilization was both highly organized and creatively rich, an impressive balance of bureaucracy and artistry. And, naturally, there's the human story. The quirks and ironies that make history more digestible. Moctezuma II, whose paranoia and caution contributed to the empire's downfall, becomes a symbol not just of hubris, but of the impossibility of predicting history. Cortés, who overachieved in conquest, faced his own awkward limitations, legal disputes, political rivals in Spain, and the fact that managing an empire on the other side of the ocean is harder than it looks, even with superior weapons. And yet, in their imperfections, both men are relatable. History is often messy, and the Aztec-Spanish encounter is a particularly vivid example of human unpredictability, ambition, and miscalculation. The broader lesson gently floats into view. Civilizations, no matter how advanced, are vulnerable to factors beyond their control. Disease, foreign invasion, and social fragility can dismantle even the most impressive urban and political systems. Yet, cultural practices, knowledge, and human creativity often endure, quietly adapting to new circumstances. The Aztec Empire's story is not only one of collapse, but of persistence, echoing through centuries in language, ritual, cuisine, and urban design. So, as we drift toward the present, imagine standing on the ruins of Tenochtitlan today, or rather, walking through modern Mexico City, layered over the ancient foundations. Beneath your feet, canals were once carefully engineered, markets thrived, and temples rose toward the sun. And above you, city streets follow patterns laid centuries ago, churches occupy sacred spaces, and traditions survive in subtle, persistent forms. It's a city of memory, resilience, and quiet contradictions. Even in literature, art, and academic study, the Aztecs continue to fascinate. Their codices, architecture, and recorded rituals offer insight into a civilization that achieved remarkable sophistication in a relatively short span. The empire's collapse is tragic, but its cultural and intellectual legacy is enduring. Scholars often note that understanding the Aztecs is less about mourning what was lost and more about appreciating the complexities, innovations, and adaptability of a society that faced immense challenges and still left a lasting mark. And finally, it's worth contemplating the human element once more. The Aztecs were not just rulers, priests, or warriors. They were people with families, fears, ambitions, and routines. Children learned to weave and trade, artisans practiced intricate crafts, and elders debated the will of the gods. Even under extreme duress, disease, conquest, social upheaval, these human patterns persisted. The rise and fall of the Aztec Empire is, in many ways, a story about the enduring resilience of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. And so, dear listener, as we gently float over the echoes of Tenochtitlan, we notice that the empire's end is not absolute. It persists in subtle, quiet ways. In the layout of streets, the rituals of festivals, the language spoken, and the persistent curiosity of historians piecing together codices. History in this sense is less a tidy narrative of victory and defeat, more a layered, ongoing conversation between past and present. Take a slow breath. Picture the canals once again, the floating gardens and the temples, both standing and transformed. Imagine the people walking the streets, negotiating their survival, preserving what they could, and adapting to a world that had changed abruptly.
Part 4. Reflections on an Empire. Lessons, ironies, and lingering echoes. All right. So we've drifted along canals, watched Tenochtitlan rise from a swampy island, observed the audacious Cortés arrive, and seen the empire unravel under the combined weight of disease, diplomacy, and human fallibility. Now, as we settle in for the final leg of this story, let's float slowly over the ruins, both literal and metaphorical, and consider what the Aztec Empire teaches us, not in a dramatic, moralistic way, but in a quiet, reflective, slightly ironic way. One of the first things to note is how incredibly ambitious the Mexica were. For a people who were once wandering outsiders, they built a city that was sophisticated, vibrant, and highly organized. Canals instead of streets, floating gardens, marketplaces humming with trade, urban planning that rivals Venice in ingenuity, but with more ritual, more temples, and admittedly more blood sacrifices. Their achievements remind us that human creativity, persistence, and the occasional stubbornness can transform marginal beginnings into extraordinary results. Even with the ever-present threat of flooding, mosquitoes, or hostile neighbors, they thrived. And yet, ambition, as history often reminds us, comes with vulnerabilities. Moctezuma II's paranoia, while entirely understandable, didn't exactly help matters when strangers arrived with guns, horses, and smallpox. Cortés's audacity, combined with local discontent, exploited cracks in an otherwise resilient empire. The result wasn't a spectacular battle scene or heroic last stand, but a slow, quiet dismantling of social and urban structures, punctuated by an epidemic that neither technology nor ritual could resolve. There's a certain ironic beauty in that. The grandest temples and most meticulous codices couldn't prevent a microscopic virus from wreaking havoc. Yet, in the midst of this tragedy, culture persisted. Language, art, ritual, and knowledge quietly adapted to new realities. Nahuatl survived, codices were preserved or translated, and festivals found subtle ways to merge pre-Columbian and European elements. Architecture, too, retained traces of genius. Streets, foundations, and city planning echoed Aztec ingenuity beneath the colonial overlay. The Aztecs, though politically defeated, left behind an enduring cultural imprint that continues to shape modern Mexico. The human stories are just as compelling.
Individuals, anonymous artisans, elders, and children adapted to the new order, teaching, preserving, and creating continuity. Ordinary people carried forward traditions, subtly reshaping them within colonial constraints. While rulers and emperors often dominate historical narratives, it's the quiet persistence of ordinary humans that ensures a civilization's echoes endure. The Aztecs were, in other words, resilient not only as an empire, but as a people. There's also a lesson in the layers of historical irony. The Mexica rose to power as outsiders, became rulers of a vast, diverse empire, and ultimately fell not to a superior army alone, but to a combination of ambition, alliance politics, biological misfortune, and human unpredictability. Cortés himself, who achieved what he did in part due to luck and timing, faced his own challenges: political rivalries in Spain, legal disputes, and the sheer difficulty of ruling across oceans. Hubris, ambition, and human fallibility seem to be timeless companions, regardless of geography or century. And so, as we gently drift through the aftermath, it's worth reflecting on the paradoxes. Tenochtitlan, once a symbol of Mexican ingenuity and ambition, was destroyed, yet its influence lingers. Human ingenuity can be fragile, yet cultural memory is stubborn. Great empires rise, fall, and transform, leaving traces that persist quietly in language, ritual, architecture, and cuisine. The Aztecs remind us that history is rarely tidy. It is layered, nuanced, and full of contradictions. Finally, let's linger on the subtle, human elements, the quirks and ironies that give the story texture. Moctezuma II, careful and paranoid, unable to fully anticipate the consequences of hospitality and diplomacy, becomes a figure of both tragedy and fascination. Cortés, bold and opportunistic, succeeds in conquest, yet cannot fully master the world he sought to dominate. Hubris, ambition, and human fallibility seem to be timeless companions, regardless of geography or century. And so, as we float over what is now modern Mexico City, imagine the streets layered with centuries of history. Canals filled in, temples replaced by churches, markets bustling with new goods but echoing ancient trade networks. Imagine the festivals that merge Aztec and Catholic traditions, the cuisine that blends old and new ingredients, and the codices carefully preserved in archives. The empire may have fallen politically, but it endures culturally, socially, and intellectually. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our gentle drift through the Aztec Empire. We've watched it rise from humble beginnings, flourish with ingenuity and ambition, encounter unforeseen challenges, and ultimately adapt, or rather, allow its people to adapt to a radically changed world. The story is not triumphant, nor is it entirely tragic. It is layered, ironic, and profoundly human. Take a slow, deep breath. Imagine the calm lakes of Texcoco, the hum of marketplaces, the quiet contemplation of priests and elders, and the ingenuity of ordinary citizens navigating extraordinary circumstances. The Aztec Empire in its rise and fall leaves behind a tapestry of human endeavor, ambition, and resilience that continues to echo quietly through time. And with that, we gently close the chapter, leaving the echoes of Tenochtitlan to drift softly into history.
an empire remembered not only for its spectacular rise and dramatic fall, but for the enduring spirit of its people, the subtle persistence of its culture, and the quiet lessons it offers to anyone patient enough to listen. Sleepily, we let the story settle, like dust over ancient stones, canals reflecting moonlight, and history itself murmuring softly across the centuries. Good night, and may your thoughts drift gently over pyramids, canals, and floating gardens, with a soft reminder that even empires, no matter how grand, leave quiet echoes that endure long after their rulers have gone.